If your dog is in love with their food and desperate to bolt it down as quickly as possible, there's definitely a few things that you can do to turn that sprint into a marathon. G'day, I'm Dr. Karen. Look, while dogs eating quickly in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem, it is something that can lead to some fairly significant issues. There's lots of different reasons why dogs really rush at their food, not the least of which being that a lot of dogs just really like to eat. And if your dog was born into a rather large litter, competition is also going to play a huge role here. You'd be surprised how long they retain that drive to compete for their food long after they've left their litter mates behind. So even if you've only got one dog in the house, they may still feel that they need to get that food down as quickly as possible or risk missing out altogether. If you do have multiple dogs, then that drive to compete to make sure they don't miss out on a meal can really amp up the speed in which they're going to try and get their food down. And that's something to really keep an eye on. If your dogs are eating close to one another and they are eating really quickly, paying attention to what's going on in the other dog's bowls, then you may want to consider actually feeding them separately. Not just to avoid any conflict over food, but to take away that stress of eating so fast before anyone else can get to their bowl. When eating quickly can become a real problem is when you've got larger dogs that are much more predisposed to a condition called bloat, which can then progress to a potentially fatal situation called GDV, which is short for gastric dilatation and volvulus. This is basically a fancy way of saying the stomach gets overly full, gets full of gas, and then the inflammation causes it to twist on itself, which, as you can imagine, is extremely painful, and as the blood supply gets cut off, very, very dangerous. So when you've got large, deep-chested dogs like Great Danes, Dobermans, Irish Wolfhounds, even Greyhounds are much more predisposed to this condition, largely because there is space for the stomach to twist. Whilst it's not impossible for smaller dogs to get GDV, it's really, really unlikely, largely due to their anatomy. That doesn't mean that small dogs can't suffer with bloat, and eating too quickly, especially if they're then swallowing air at the same time, can lead to a really uncomfortable situation. So in any event, it's something we want to try to avoid. Another issue is if your dog is eating a dry kibble diet, because if they eat that really quickly, as the moisture then hits it in the stomach, that food expands. So you've gone from eating this much food to having this much food in the stomach, which again, you can imagine is going to be pretty uncomfortable. Now, there's a few different ways that we can try and slow down the speed of your dog's eating. We've already mentioned separating dogs if they are seeming to be in competition with each other. Another one that I use with my dogs is a slow feeder bowl. Really simple in design. They've basically just got these sort of high protrusions, so the food goes in there, but your dog has to basically chase the food around those protrusions. So it's physically slowing them down and stopping them from just taking big gulping bites of their food. An even simpler version of this is getting a much larger bowl than your dog might need. Physically spreading their food over a larger surface means that they cannot take big bites of their food. They're literally having to go and pick up bits of individual food over a slower period of time, which actually is a great way to add a little bit of enrichment to your dog's life as well, making the process of eating a little bit more of a challenge rather than a race. So you can turn your dog's meal times into something more of a marathon than a sprint. If your dog is on a dry kibble diet and they do tend to bolt that food down, you might want to consider pre-soaking the food. This will actually reduce how much it then goes on to expand in the stomach. What I tend to do is actually use hot or even boiling water poured over the food and then leave it to sit for at least half an hour, making sure to test the temperature of the food before offering it to your dog. It's also a really easy way to increase your dog's water intake with very little effort. What's really important though is to sit down and address why is your dog eating so quickly. It's essential to make sure that there's not a health reason that's driving their speed of eating, something like intestinal parasites or even a health condition that's driving up that appetite. So this is particularly important if either you've got a very young puppy or a dog that's suddenly become more ravenous. These are things that you don't want to just sit around and wait for. You do want to speak to your vet. You might want to think about whether you've changed the type of food. Dog foods are not created equal. So your dog might be finding they're actually needing to eat more of a new food than they did of the old one. Another factor to keep in mind is if your dog is rushing their food down, are they keeping it down? Some dogs may eat so quickly that they actually regurgitate the food, or they may vomit the food up later on. And if this is happening on a regular basis, it's definitely something that needs veterinary attention. If you're worried that your dog's eating habits have changed, then you definitely want to speak to your vet, or you can head over to pangovet.com and make an appointment for an online consultation with one of the vets there without even leaving the comfort of your home.